In the dim morning haze over the Pacific, a giant silhouette cut through the waves, its radar screens pulsing with cold green light. Men stood silently at their stations, listening to the mechanical heartbeat of a war machine built for the kind of battle that decides the fate of nations. Yet beneath that steel confidence lay an unspoken truth. One few would have dared to whisper at the time. How could a ship built with such power, precision, and promise become remembered not for the trials of combat, but for a moment of quiet ceremony? How does a vessel crafted for the fury of naval warfare become a symbol of victory without ever enduring the crucible that defined the greatest fighting ships of its era? American history often celebrates the images we remember, not the battles we forget. And somewhere between legend and reality lies a contradiction that reshaped the legacy of an entire class of warships. As we follow this story to its core, we uncover a surprising divide between fame and effectiveness, between the ships that carried the weight of desperate battles and the one that stood in the spotlight when the guns finally fell silent. Long before the war reached its final, smoldering months, global strategy was already shifting beneath the surface. The Pacific Ocean had become a vast arena of ambition, where empires gambled everything on steel, fire, and courage. Japan's naval planners placed their hopes on super battleships like Yamato and Musashi, monstrous vessels conceived to crush any American ship that dared challenge them. In Washington, naval architects worked against the clock, knowing that the United States needed a new class of battleship capable of matching such giants. From that urgency emerged the Iowa-class battleships, leaner and faster than any American predecessors. These ships carried the weight of a changing doctrine. They were designed to chase down enemy carriers at flank speed and to stand in the battle line against the most heavily armored ships afloat. Yet even in the shipyards where sparks lit the night sky, there was an awareness that war itself was evolving. Aircraft carriers had begun rewriting the rules, and every nation with an ocean to defend could feel it. Missouri entered this story not as an afterthought, but as a masterpiece of American naval engineering. Her 9 16-inch guns promised decisive power at ranges few adversaries could match. Her armor belt, angled and reinforced, represented decades of lessons learned from earlier battleship losses. And deep inside her hull, the plotting rooms and analog computers pulsed with the quiet precision of a weapon built for conditions no human eye could track. Many of the men who stepped aboard her knew they were serving on a ship built for the climactic engagements of the Pacific War. But history did not wait for Missouri to arrive. By the time her hull slid down the ways in 1944, the Pacific had already shifted into a new phase. Carrier aviation had devastated Japan's naval air arm at Midway, at the Philippine Sea, and again at Leyte Gulf. The battles that were meant to define the era of steel giants had already been fought, leaving behind wreckage on the ocean floor and a sobering realization: the decisive weapons of the war no longer fired shells. They launched aircraft. Missouri's commissioning came with anticipation, but also with the quiet frustration of sailors who understood what she had missed. They studied the after-action reports from Guadalcanal, where American battleships fought at point-blank range in the darkness, trading salvos with Japanese gunners who could hit back with equal ferocity. They examined the losses and the heroism of earlier campaigns, understanding that those desperate nights had pushed American warships to their breaking point. Missouri's crew trained for battles their ship had been built to win, knowing that those battles no longer existed. When Missouri finally crossed the Pacific and entered the combat zone in early 1945, the sea had grown eerily quiet. Japan's navy was shattered. Its carrier force was gone. Its battleships were trapped in port without fuel. Missouri had arrived at the end of a war defined by ships that came before her, ships that had borne the heaviest burdens when the outcome was uncertain. The stage she stepped onto was no longer the arena of giants, but the final chapter of a story already decided. And in that contrast between a ship built for decisive battle and a war that had moved beyond it, the paradox of Missouri's legacy quietly began to take shape. When Missouri finally joined the fleet at the front, the war's tempo had shifted into its last, grinding phase. The island campaigns had grown more desperate, more violent, and more complex, with American forces fighting inch by inch across volcanic rock and fortified cliffs. Missouri's guns thundered across the horizons of Iwo Jima and Okinawa, their shockwaves rolling over the sea like distant storms. From her decks, sailors watched the fireballs rise from shoreline bunkers shattered by 16-inch shells, each blast carving open the defensive systems that had taken years for Japan to construct. Shore bombardment demanded precision and nerves. The gunners could not see the men they were helping, but they knew Marines were advancing under fire, depending on those guns to punch holes in lethal terrain. Reports filtered back through radio circuits, bunkers neutralized, artillery pits silenced, cave systems collapsed under the weight of Missouri's shells. The ship did not face a matching opponent here. The enemy was the silent shape of a mountain ridge or a trench line cut into black stone. Yet the consequences of each broadside were measured in the lives of Americans clawing their way ashore. But the calm of long-range fire did not last. On the 19th of March 1945, the horizon erupted into chaos when a Japanese Judy dive bomber broke through the layers of combat air patrol above Task Force 58. The sky, moments earlier a pale spring morning, became a funnel of incoming fire as dozens of ships opened up in unison. Missouri's gunners fired until their barrels glowed, sending proximity-fused shells and streams of tracers toward the falling silhouette. The noise was a solid wall. The air itself seemed to tear apart under the weight of explosions. And yet the Judy kept coming. In a moment that stunned every witness, the bomber survived the storm of steel and plunged directly into USS Franklin. The carrier vanished behind columns of flame as bombs and aviation fuel ignited deep within her decks. Explosions ripped through compartments where crews had been preparing for flight operations only minutes earlier. Missouri's sailors watched the burning ship stagger under the blast, and for many of them, it was the first time they saw the true vulnerability of a modern warship under concentrated attack. The fight to save Franklin lasted hours, testing the courage of damage control teams who crawled into smoke-choked compartments to halt a cascade of fires that threatened to melt the carrier from within. Missouri's role in that moment was bitterly symbolic. Witness to catastrophe and participant in the defense of the task force, but unable to change the fate of the ship carrying hundreds of American lives. The crew understood then that their guns, however advanced, could not guarantee protection in the chaotic geometry of war. Weeks later, Missouri faced another test, this time at close range. A Japanese Zero, heavily damaged and trailing smoke, broke through the defenses and dove toward her starboard side. Again, the guns erupted. Again, the tracers stitched across the sky. And again, a single aircraft pressed through the fire. The impact shook the ship, but caused only superficial damage, leaving a dent in the armor belt and a scattered trail of debris on the sea. The pilot died instantly, a lone figure swallowed by the enormity of a war almost over. Captain William Callahan ordered the man buried with full honors, a gesture of humanity amid the impersonal calculus of naval warfare. Sailors paused on deck as the shrouded form slid beneath the waves, and for a moment the noise of battle fell away. Even in the final months of the Pacific War, that ceremony became a reminder that every explosion, every impact, had a human face behind it. This was Missouri's combat high point, a series of moments shaped not by duels with enemy battleships, but by the unpredictable violence of air attacks and the grinding demands of supporting troops ashore. It was not the kind of glory she had been built for, but it was the war she inherited. As the Pacific War drew toward its end, Missouri's story began moving in a direction few sailors aboard her could have predicted. Her guns still thundered against coastal fortifications, and her radar still swept the dark horizon for threats that seldom appeared, yet the war's decisive moments were passing elsewhere. The destruction of Japan's naval air arm, the collapse of its merchant fleet, and the relentless bombardment of its cities left the enemy's remaining defenses hollow and exhausted. Missouri remained powerful, but the war no longer offered opportunities for the kind of trial she had been built to endure. When Japanese resistance finally fractured, the world's attention turned not to the ships that had fought the longest, but to the one that would host the final act. The surrender ceremony required a stage one symbolic, one photogenic, one capable of carrying the weight of history's gaze. Missouri, named for President Harry Truman's home state, emerged as the perfect choice for reasons that had little to do with battle performance. Officials in Washington understood that this moment needed a ship that represented American resolve and post-war leadership, and Missouri's towering profile offered exactly the image they sought. In the weeks before the ceremony, the ship underwent a transformation unlike anything she had experienced in combat. Crews scraped rust from her steel, repainted every surface in perfect haze gray, polished brass until it shimmered under the morning light. The preparations were not merely cosmetic. They were ritual, a deliberate shaping of the vessel into a symbol worthy of global memory. Sailors, who had spent months manning guns and damage control stations, now became stewards of a floating monument, aware that the world would judge their ship not by shells fired, but by the image she projected. On the 2nd of September 1945, Missouri lay anchored in Tokyo Bay, surrounded by the silent silhouettes of hundreds of Allied warships. The morning clouds drifted above her decks as representatives from nations that had bled across continents assembled to witness Japan's formal surrender. Cameras clicked, pens were arranged. The tension was not fear but solemnity, a global exhale after years of devastation. Missouri did not fire a shot that day, she simply held history in place. The ceremony lasted just 23 minutes. Yet those minutes eclipsed nearly everything Missouri had done in 8 months of wartime service. Photographs of MacArthur and Nimitz, of Shigemitsu signing with trembling hands, and of the Allied delegation standing beneath Missouri's massive guns were carried into newspapers, newsreels, and documentaries for decades to come. The ship became immortal not through combat, but through symbolism, a paradox that would define her legacy from that day forward. In the years after the war, this symbolic aura created an imbalance that historians would wrestle with. Battleships that had fought under ferocious conditions, North Carolina at Guadalcanal, Washington against Hiroshima, South Dakota at Santa Cruz, began to fade from public memory. They had endured torpedo hits, deck fires, electrical failures, and nights when the Pacific roared with incoming shells. But their greatest moments occurred in darkness, without cameras, without staged ceremonies. Missouri, meanwhile, carried no such scars. Her hull bore the faint dent of a kamikaze strike, but no deep wounds from battles where survival hung on a razor's edge. Instead, she bore the imprint of a pen stroke, the kind that ends wars rather than wages them. The outcome was unmistakable. Missouri became the face of victory, while the ships that had fought its hardest battles remained largely absent from the public imagination. And in that divide lay the quiet but enduring consequence of her wartime service. Missouri had not shaped the Pacific War. The Pacific War had shaped her legend. What she achieved afterward, through reputation, ceremony, and symbolism, would forever overshadow the harsher truth of what she did not have the chance to prove in battle. From an American perspective, Missouri's place in history quickly became inseparable from the image of victory she represented. In the years following the war, the ceremony on her deck became a cultural touchstone, a moment replayed in classrooms, documentaries, and commemorative events across the country. For many Americans, the sight of Japanese officials signing the surrender document beneath Missouri's towering guns symbolized not only the end of a brutal conflict, but the moral and industrial triumph of the United States. Few paused to consider that the ship's fame was built on optics rather than the furnace of battle. The Navy understood the power of that symbolism. Whenever a new strategic moment emerged, whether in Korea, the Cold War, or the Persian Gulf, Missouri was positioned not merely as a warship, but as a reminder of America's global presence. Her deployments carried political weight, projecting deterrence as much as firepower. To allies, Missouri's return signaled commitment. To adversaries, it signaled continuity. And to the American public, it reinforced the narrative that Missouri was the inheritor of a heroic wartime legacy, even if that legacy was more ceremonial than combative. The international view was more layered. For nations that had suffered under Japanese expansion, Missouri became synonymous with the closing chapter of an era defined by devastation. Standing in Tokyo Bay, she represented the moment imperial ambitions were halted and a new geopolitical order began to form. The presence of representatives from China, the United Kingdom, Australia, the Netherlands, and the Soviet Union gave the ship a global imprint, one that transcended her combat record. She became a symbol of collective victory, a stage upon which the post-war world was declared. Yet historians and naval analysts abroad often drew a sharper distinction than the American public. They viewed Missouri as a vessel whose symbolic significance far exceeded her operational achievements. They noted that the true strategic weight of the Pacific War had been carried by ships that fought early, fought often, and fought under conditions where defeat was a real possibility. To them, Missouri represented not the pinnacle of American battleship warfare, but the bookend that closed the chapter. This contrast between public reverence and analytical clarity offers a lesson about military history itself. Victory is often remembered through symbols, through moments that photograph well, through narratives that comfort or inspire. But effectiveness is measured in the hard calculus of battle, in risk endured, in losses taken, in decisions made when outcomes were uncertain. Missouri's fame, shaped by ceremony and preserved through memory, reflects the power of narrative. Her sister's legacies, shaped by combat, reflect the far heavier price of triumph. History often remembers the ships that stood in the spotlight, not the ones that carried the heaviest burdens. USS Missouri became the most recognizable battleship of the Pacific War, not because of the duels she fought, but because of the moment she hosted 23 minutes that closed the bloodiest conflict in human history. She became a symbol of peace, a monument to American resolve, and a vessel forever tied to the image of surrender in Tokyo Bay. But symbols, however powerful, do not always reveal the full story. Behind Missouri stood a fleet of battleships whose names rarely appear in documentaries or commemorative speeches. North Carolina, South Dakota, Washington, ships that endured torpedo hits, night battles, and terrifying moments when the outcome rested on a single radar contact or a single salvo. Their decks bore scars that Missouri never knew, their crew lists held names lost to the sea, and their logs recorded battles fought when victory was not yet assured. These ships shaped the Pacific War through action, not ceremony, through endurance rather than recognition. Missouri's legacy, then, is not diminished by her lack of combat trials. It is reframed. She represents the end of a long struggle rather than its darkest hours. Her gleaming decks on the 2nd of September 1945 remind us that even in war, there must be a moment where weapons grow silent and nations choose a different path. Standing today in Pearl Harbor, just yards from the wreck of USS Arizona, she forms a bridge between the war's beginning and its end, between loss and closure, between devastation and the hope of rebuilding. But as we reflect on the Pacific War, it is worth asking what truly defines greatness in military history. Is it the ceremony photographed for the world, or the unseen night battle fought under a black sky? Is it the ship remembered for its symbolic triumph, or the one remembered by veterans whose lives depended on her guns? These questions sit at the heart of how we understand the legacy of the American battleship. If this story moved you, consider sharing your thoughts. Which ships, in your view, best represent the real weight of the Pacific War? And what lessons do their journeys leave for us today? Thank you for being here. Your curiosity keeps history alive. If you wish to explore more stories of strategy, sacrifice, and the ships that shaped our world, feel free to join us for the next chapter.